everyone to HR Recruit's webinar, Understanding the Menopause from a HR and Employment Law Perspective. My name is Amy McLeod and I'm a consultant from HR Recruit. I'm joined today by Louise Brenlund, Senior Associate from Brachers, and Louise is going to be sharing her knowledge around what to consider when dealing with employee issues arising from the menopause. I'm now going to pass over to Louise, who is going to run through a presentation with you, and then towards the end of the session, there is an opportunity for you to ask questions using the chat box. There is no email facility, contrary to what Zoom may have informed you. Over to you, Louise.
Lovely, thanks a lot, Amy. So thanks ever so much to HR Recruit inviting me to step in and speak about this subject. It's a subject I'm very passionate about, and we worked recently with the British Medical Association and did a webinar on this, and it's something that we're really seeking to encourage in the workplace. So today I am going to cover a brief bit around menopause awareness. I'm then going to look at employers' current legal obligations, then look at some relevant case logs. I think it's always helpful to give you a bit of an understanding around the sort of decisions that are currently being made. Look at the changing obligations and then cover some guidance in the workplace. So first of all, the menopause itself. So as you may or may not be aware, World Menopause Day and Menopause Month has actually been celebrated since around 2014, and it's usually celebrated in October. And I think we really saw a massive raise in awareness last year, particularly because there was a number of celebrities getting on board with this. And you might recall there was Davina McCall and Channel 4 that did a lot last year around menopause raising and awareness, which I think is absolutely brilliant, but it's really brought this to the forefront. And there was a number of other things that went on last year, which I'll cover briefly from a legal perspective, which has also kind of started moving this forward. And I think is really the reason now why lots of businesses are starting to sort of think about this and say, oh, do we need to be doing something? Don't we need to be doing something? So the purpose of today is really for me to give you some knowledge, help raise that awareness, and so you can start thinking about, well, what can we do in the workplace to help our line managers, help our staff, and encourage thinking around this. So first of all, the menopause itself marks the end of the reproductive life cycle, as it says on here. So it's actually when there's been a point of 12 months with no cycle at all. So reproduction has effectively stopped. Prior to that, there's a session that's called the perimenopause. And I was quite surprised when I started working around the menopause to find out that that can actually start as early as the mid-30s and can be as late as the mid-50s. So kind of thinking around and looking at some of the background is quite helpful, so that you as HR or managers can understand that sometimes some of these symptoms might be related to this. Sometimes individuals don't even want to think about it themselves. So it's trying to get people to talk about things, encourage them to think maybe it could be that, and is it something they want to share, but also accepting not everybody's going to want to talk about those things as well. So as I say, the average onset of the actual menopause is 51 years. And 80% of women menopausal by the age of 54. But again, a little bit of a shocker. That means that 1/3 usually of a woman's life is after the menopause. So that means all of the things that go with the menopause is taking up 1/3 of their life. And that's actually quite a large part of the working life now, as we'll go on to see. And over 75% of women have menopausal symptoms. I think it's really important to remember, again, not everyone's affected in the same way. Some people are really lucky and have no symptoms at all. Some people have symptoms, but usually around 75% of women do have those symptoms. I had to add this picture because I love this, saying, I'm still hot, it just comes in flashes now. I thought it was a great little picture that I use. So just to flag for you some of the common symptoms as well around the menopause. So what's referred to as the vasomotor symptoms. So that's the hot flashes, night sweats, heat palpitations, changes to blood pressure. They tend to be grouped together and tend to sort of come together. But again, it can happen independently and differently. But other things that might be affecting an individual. And again, if you think about these symptoms and then how they can impact on work. So insomnia If a person's tired, then that's definitely likely to affect them coming into work the next day. Poor memory, concentration and brain fog, depending upon their job and what they're doing, that's likely to have effect. Mood changes, joint aches, low energy levels, low sex drive, and many other issues. There's actually probably around 35 symptoms, I believe it is, between 35 and 37 common symptoms, but they're just some of the key ones for you to think about and look out for, which would probably affect work. So why is it important? 14 million workdays are lost in the UK economy due to women taking time off to manage menopausal symptoms. And that's through what we know about and where women have actually been prepared to say and tell us. So there actually may be many more than that. And, that's a very large amount anyway. The other thing is that women over 50 are the fastest growing group of employees. So they've got significant skills, knowledge, experience, and they're a really valuable business asset. So if those women aren't being supported or don't feel that they're being supported in the workplace, then what we're finding is a lot of those women are simply deciding, I'm not going to carry on, and resigning and leaving their jobs. So actually businesses are losing very valuable individuals if they're not addressing this. So again, really important reason to think about this. Between the ages of 40 and 55, 80% of women experience up to 34 physical and psychological symptoms of menopause, and 1 in 4 of those suffer so severely they need significant support to maintain normal performance at work. So again, you look at those figures, 1 in 4 is suffering severely and needs support. And actually that might just be being ignored or not dealt with. That could then lead to performance issues. That could then lead to them not being at work. That could then lead to them resigning. You can see the knock-on effect for everything here. And many employers have noticed flagging productivity, higher absence levels and low morale or motivation. So if you deal with those things, if you start addressing this and thinking about those things, that's going to be really important for your business, because you can then look at benefits are going to be increased because hopefully you'll have more engagement and loyalty from individuals. Hopefully you'll be able to lower your sickness absence and potentially employee turnover. And also this is really important because it's supporting both age and gender inclusivity. So the things we'll talk about here, if you are developing those in the workplace, this is going to make you an employer to go to. So, we all know at the moment it's quite difficult to find individuals and be attractive, and how can you stand out as an employer? Well, looking at this might make you a standout employer and someone to go to, and they may choose you over somebody else. So just a little infograph here, which I find helpful and something I wanted to point out. So something that also gets forgotten is it tends to be menopause women. Actually, partners are left feeling helpless here. You can see 38% of partners say they feel helpless when it comes to supporting their partner through the menopause. And 28% of partners say they often end up having arguments because they don't understand what she's going through. So again, you think about that and the effect in the workplace, that actually it's not just women that's affecting. If a man has had an argument, they haven't been able to sleep, and then they're affected in the workplace as well. It's a knock-on effect again. So it's like your whole workforce you need to be thinking about. So it's not just the women, there's other people potentially that are affected by this as well. So what are the current legal obligations? So as you're probably aware, currently there's no specific protection in relation to the menopause. So we haven't got anything that says not doing things because a lady is menopausal is illegal. However, there are a number of ways that claims can be brought because of the menopause. So one of the ways is an unfair dismissal claim. So that would only be able to be brought if an individual has over 2 years service. And the way that this type of claim is usually brought in relation to the menopause is if they feel that there's been a fundamental breach of contract, and that individual then usually resign in response to that breach of contract and bring a claim for constructive unfair dismissal. Now, as I say, there's kind of some disadvantages to that are that they'd have to have over 2 years service. And the other disadvantage to that is that even if they were successful with that type of claim, the compensation that can be awarded is limited to the maximum of 52 weeks gross pay, or the statutory limit, which is around 86,000 at the moment. So that can mean that actually, even if they're successful, if they were on £20,000 a year, they would never be given more compensation than £20,000 a year. So for that reason, sometimes if an individual is looking to bring a claim, the unfair dismissal claim isn't necessarily attractive. So what is then looked at is claims under the Equality Act 2010, as I've flagged on my slide. So there's a number of possible claims that menopause could be brought into. So that could be age, that could be sex, or it could be disability discrimination. So they're all protected characteristics under the Equality Act, and to be able to bring a claim, it would have to fall within one of the protected characteristics. Now, the most usual claims that we're seeing in this regard are discrimination claims in relation to disability. But again, and what you've probably seen in the press is that when disability discrimination claims are being brought, there's a definition of disability under the Equality Act 2010. So to be able to do that, before an individual would be able to bring that claim, they would have to say that their menopause is a disability under the Equality Act 2010. So just to give you a heads up on what that definition is. So the definition of disability is a physical or mental impairment which has a substantial and long-term, which is at least 12 months, adverse effect on an individual's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. Now, the intention of today isn't to go into that breakdown, but for claims to succeed, they would have to succeed in all aspects of that definition. And what often can be the difficult stage is that the effect of normal day-to-day activities. So they'd have to prove that menopause and the symptoms of the menopause is affecting them in respect to normal day-to-day activities. So the difficulty has been that many women have found that they are suffering, but they can't bring themselves within that definition. So the arguments that we've been starting to see is that it's unfair that a woman has to do that and then perhaps can't bring a claim because they can't bring themselves within that definition. The other type of claims that can be brought and have to be considered are the protection under Haswell 1974. So that's a duty on employers to protect the health, safety and welfare of all of their employees. So connected with that is the obligation for you to consider risk assessments. So again, you need to be looking at identifying who might be particularly at risk at work. So connected with what I was saying earlier, there's a potential here that there's more than one person. You've potentially got the menopausal woman, but you've also potentially got in your workplace a husband or a partner that could also be being affected by those symptoms. So potentially you need to be carrying out risk assessments which cover each of those categories, and then looking at can you make any adjustments in the workplace to help with that. So for example, you might be looking at introducing fans and doing other things that risk assessment shows that could be an issue. So as I mentioned, looking at some cases to try to give some real life examples of this. Now, what we are seeing is an increase in employment tribunals of the number of cases actually citing menopause as being the issue. So there was some facts and figures at the end of last year, which I think are really a helpful reflection of this. So in 2018, we only saw 5 cases in the employment tribunal citing menopause. 2019, that went up to 6, no great increase, but 2020, that went up to 16, so quite a large increase. Then in 2021, for the first part, we had so far had 10 cases. We haven't yet got the facts and figures around the number of cases for the latter part of 2021, but that was expecting to at least double. So you can see there's been really huge increases, and whether that's just because people are becoming more aware and or more prepared to talk about this and cite the menopause within claims, it's not entirely clear, but we do believe that that's why we're seeing more of this, because there's a combination of more understanding, more willing to talk about things, and also, as I say, because it's becoming more to the forefront with celebrities and the government considering this, we're only likely to see more of this. So the cases I've got here, so the first one, Birchall versus Project One Consulting Limited. This was an employment tribunal claim. And the individual, Miss Birchall, she was a consultant. She was earning around £120,000 per year plus bonuses. So it was in quite a demanding job involving long hours and travel. Before she started work, she did inform her employer via the health questionnaire, which many of you probably asked to be completed, that she was experiencing menopausal symptoms, but indicated she hadn't taken any time off work due to those symptoms. The only other time, though, she appears to have mentioned this, according to the case, is in response to an email that went out from HR, where they were talking about private medical insurance, was saying that they were increasing the medical insurance to cover some help in relation to the menopause. And she'd responded and said, "That's really good. I'm happy to hear that." Apart from that, she'd not given any indication that the menopause was affecting her performance or there was any issue with it. So her performance did go downhill. Her employers weren't happy with that, and her attitude also changed, and employers weren't happy with that, and eventually they did dismiss her. The individual brought a case of direct discrimination because of her sex, and she argued, amongst other things, that her employer knew she was menopausal and they'd failed to take that into consideration when reviewing her performance. However, what the tribunal said was that they rejected this because there was no evidence that Mrs. Birchall's performance might have been adversely impacted by her menopause. So importantly here, what they found was she'd never actually told them that her menopause was causing her any difficulties. It was an issue with her performance. She'd never requested any support. She'd never requested any changes to be made. So that outcome probably would have been different if she had been raising it and talking about it, but because they weren't on notice of it, it hadn't affected their decision making in dismissing her. So she didn't succeed in that case. The second case, Sloan and Dumfries. Again, this was a Scottish employment tribunal case. So she worked as a secretary in the hospital, and there'd been a reorganisation. She was moved into a new building and it was open plan. And basically, as a result of that, Mrs. Sloan then complained about poor air quality, which she believed was causing her to have headaches. She was referred to occupational health, but she didn't follow the advice that was given. She actually ended up resigning, and she brought a claim for constructive unfair dismissal plus age and sex discrimination. In relation to the discrimination claims, she argued that she and her colleagues were required to work in an environment where the air quality and temperature was below the required standard, and that this amounted to a provision criterion or practice, or commonly known as a PCP. She argued that this placed women and those aged between 50 and 65 at a significant disadvantage. So she'd obviously picked that age gap because that's the age of menopausal women. The tribunal rejected her claims, though, because they found that Mrs. Sloan hadn't provided any evidence to establish that the PCP she relied on and the air quality and temperature met unreasonable standards. So there were reasonable standards. They went on to say, even if she had cleared that hurdle, so first of all, she would have had to clear the hurdle that there was a PCP, but even if she had been able to prove that, she failed to present any evidence to suggest that her work environment put women of that age at a particular disadvantage when compared to men. So I hope you can see what I'm trying to say is that these claims can be brought, but there's many hurdles in trying to get through what is a discrimination claim or what is required of a discrimination claim. So another example of this is the Rose versus Commissioner of Police for the Metropolis, another employment tribunal claim. So again, these claims are all in the employment tribunal. We haven't yet seen anything going to Court of Appeal or Supreme Court. Those cases are binding upon us. So the employment tribunal decisions, whilst influential and should be considered by judges and considered by us in advising businesses, they're not actually binding. So this case, she was a police officer and she had a number of medical conditions. She began to experience menopausal symptoms in addition to those other medical conditions which affected her sleep. And it made it difficult for her to work at nights because she was a night worker. So her employer took her off night duty and referred her to occupational health. She was subsequently signed off work due to depression and stress. Her manager did speak to her regularly to find out how she was feeling and to explore when she might be able to return to work. During some of those meetings, she did mention she was having some problems with the menopause, but as well as unrelated issues. Her medical records did indicate she'd sought advice from her doctor around the menopause and that she was suffering with things such as night sweats, flushing and sweating. She later resigned because of the way her absence had been dealt with by her employer, and she brought proceedings against her employer, arguing she'd been discriminated against in part because of her early menopause. This was a disability discrimination claim, but the tribunal concluded that her menopausal symptoms didn't amount to a disability because there was no evidence that they adversely affected her ability to carry out day-to-day activities. What they said was, we conclude that an ability to work at night is not a day-to-day activity, and in any event, it is unclear to what extent the menopause, rather than the claimant's other conditions, impacted upon this. So as you can see, that was the bit I referred to earlier in having to fulfill that description of what a disability is. She hadn't fulfilled that. Now, I would raise one caution of awareness in respect of that case, is that although it wasn't appealed, we do think it likely that it may not succeed if it's raised as another argument, because there is specific guidance around day-to-day activities, and that guidance does actually suggest that night work potentially could be considered to be a day-to-day activity. So there's potentially a conflict there, and that argument wouldn't necessarily work going forward. Then the last case, McMahon versus Rothwell. This was an individual where she had a number of short-term absences, some of which could have been related to the menopause but wasn't clear. She then came back to work and then had a number of further short-term absences which weren't related to the menopause. Her employer basically felt she'd become unreliable and dismissed her for poor timekeeping, taking extended breaks, and the frequency of her absences. She brought proceedings and argued that her absences and poor timekeeping were caused by her menopausal symptoms, and that her dismissal amounted to unfavourable treatment arising out of her disability. She also argued that there'd been a failure to make reasonable adjustments, which is another requirement if an individual is disabled. But the tribunal again rejected her claims. They accepted that the menopausal symptoms could be a disability. So we've got this a number of times in cases that menopausal symptoms could be a disability. But in this case, they found that they were not substantial, and she'd not provided evidence that corroborated her symptoms and the effect they had on her on a day-to-day basis. So therefore, her claim didn't succeed. So I was trying to emphasise there kind of things you need to be thinking about in terms of notification, whether an individual would fall within that or not. There have been some successful claims. So on the flip side of that, one of the most recent ones was a case which was quite widely reported in the newspapers called Quananaka and Textbook Teachers Limited. That was last year in the Employment Tribunal. And interestingly, it was a disability-related harassment claim. So there were other disability claims which didn't succeed, but the harassment claim did succeed. And the reason for that was that there'd been a lack of sympathy from the employers when this individual was faced with menopausal symptoms. She was at basically age 37. She also had other issues going on, but comments, when you read this, the comments that were made are disgusting. So things like, this was no big deal. Oh, you're never going to be able to have children again. That's not an issue. Oh, you're going to have a high libido now because of the hormones you're taking. So managers were taking and making these kind of comments, and that was given in evidence. So there was found to be disability harassment as a result of that. So that emphasises what we're going to go on to talk about is raising awareness and understanding what is appropriate to say, what isn't appropriate to say, and how important it is for line managers and those dealing with individuals to be aware of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So how are legal obligations changing? So there's been an argument for reform as on my slide here. So, and as I've mentioned already, so there's been many different individuals, people coming forward and saying that it's not fair that it's not a recognised disability. And so things such as cancer, for example, are immediately recognised as a disability. What's being suggested is either that the menopause should be a recognised disability, or that it should be discrimination in itself. So it should be a characteristic that's recognised, like age, like disability, like, you know, sex, for example. There is some people that are saying actually the menopause shouldn't become a protected characteristic because it shouldn't be seen in that way, and once it's put into that light, it may be treated badly again, and it's been a big taboo. Is that going to create it as more of a taboo or not? So is it good or bad? I personally think probably that it shouldn't become a protected characteristic, because I think the there is enough there, for example, under disability and what I've just talked about, that if it is affecting an individual that much, they could take steps and would be able to take steps. And actually, I think it possibly could have a negative effect if it is recognised in that way. However, what we have had is, so at the end of last year, there was an inquiry from the Women and Equalities Committee, which was entitled "An Invisible Cohort, Why Are Workplaces Failing Women Going Through Menopause?" So that inquiry has been scrutinising current legislation, looking at whether it's good enough or not, looking at workplace practices and procedures. And in fact, there was a further part of the inquiry that took place only yesterday, with various members being invited, and different agencies and people that look at the menopause being invited to speak, and they were actually talking about policy. If you're that interested, it is recorded, you can go and listen to that. So that is an ongoing discussion that's taking place. So the other thing is the House of Commons Women's and Equalities Committee inquiry. Sorry, that's what I just mentioned, that opened on the 23rd of July and closed in September. There was also linked to that has been Davina McCall and the Channel 4 investigations going on, which is increasing publicity around those areas. And just, I think, making more people talk about it. So will it be a legal requirement to have a workplace menopause policy is the question put here, and is a question that a lot of our clients are asking us. So at the moment, no, it's not a legal requirement, but one of the things that are being discussed as part of this ongoing inquiry is that actually, should it be made a requirement? This is probably looking more likely to happen than not. We can't say it definitely will, but definitely from the comments that are being made around this, it does seem likely that it will become a legal requirement. I can't tell you when that's going to be, and it will be a keep an eye on this space, keep an eye on Brachers' website, because we'll keep you updated with that. But it does seem more likely than not that that will happen. So talking about that policy, it's good therefore to start thinking about that now, and think about, you know, actually, do you want to be a leader in this field? Is it good to have a policy in place before it's made a legal requirement? And then, will menopause become a protected characteristic? So I've already touched on that, really, that there's pros and cons against this. Again, the way it's looking at is that probably it's not going to become a protected characteristic, but it's still something that's under discussion. And the comments that are being made are that if women are feeling that they can't bring the claims, which is the feedback that they're getting, so for example, you know, it was an issue in relation to individuals that were gay, and then that specifically has become protected, then why shouldn't the menopause be legislated for so it's specifically protected? So yes, it's a possibility. I can't say yes or no. It's still being debated. So yes, do keep watching out and looking out for this. It is something that could potentially change in the future. So looking at guidance in the workplace, so the kind of things that have been being requested, so there's lots of surveys around this, and information that's available that you can go out and get, as I say, from British Medical Society, from ACAS, there's a really good HemPICT, and there's lots of places out there that can provide you with information. But some of the main feedback I pulled out, which I thought would be helpful to share, was that individuals would like good awareness among managers. They would like better ventilation and temperature controls. They would like flexible working hours, formal information and advice. So the business actually making some information and advice available. Now, just to emphasise that as a business, you're not expected to be a medical advisor, and you're not expected to support in that way. But if you can point them in the right direction, a website, etc., then that could be seen as beneficial and helpful. Allowing working from home, something you might not think about. Adequate access to toilets was something that really frequently came up. And then informal support, for example, peer groups being available. So other guidance in the workplace, the things that you can start thinking about, which we've given our acronym as PETS. So first of all, policy. So as we've discussed, it seems likely that this is going to come into play. Think about your policy, and actually it's really usually quite important to think about in terms of your business and how it reflects your business specifically. And think about, is a policy actually the right thing? Sometimes the policy itself isn't the right thing. Sometimes what might be more appropriate is for you to create frameworks for both your staff and managers, so they know how to go, what questions to ask, what expectations are, rather than a defined policy, which would be more at a higher level, setting out the business's commitments and requirements. Being aware of legal responsibilities linked with the policy and what's in the policy, again, that can come within the frameworks, and thinking about how all of that fits together. The other thing that works really well also is getting buy-in from your staff. So I don't know if many of you do this when you're thinking about policies. Often it's not because you want to introduce a policy and do it as quickly as possible, but actually speaking to your staff about this and getting input from your staff can be really effective, because then you're listening to what they want, you can feed that into your policy, but the staff also feel that they've been part of that, and then they more so want to action it going forward. So if you haven't done it already, maybe getting a working group together and looking at creating a policy. Educating. So I think this is really important. A policy is a good thing, and as I say, it might be a legal requirement, but many people have policies and then don't do anything with it, or nobody understands what the requirement of the policy is, or there's no wider understanding of why that policy is there or what the implications of that policy are. So actually the education is probably the more crucial part from my perspective, and that's what we're really trying to get out there with businesses that we're working with and promoting by these webinars, to try and say, look, actually, let's educate your workforce. Let's give them some understanding around this, and let's give them some tools. And that's both your staff and managers around the menopause, creating a culture of talking about it, making clear that it's not taboo, that it is something that can be talked about, and really encouraging that, and also thinking about training that can be given and support that can be given in the workplace, which then leads on to the T for train. So training managers to understand and recognise symptoms and how to address this, not just addressing it, but also having a conversation. So as you can see, linked with those cases I raised earlier, having an appropriate conversation. And I think that's a risk and issue for a lot of businesses, particularly where there might be a number of male managers who are having to deal with females in the workplace. They're just scared of it and they don't want to approach it, and they're worried about that. But if you can train them and they know how to approach it, and they know what's right and wrong and what's appropriate and not appropriate, hopefully they will feel more comfortable with discussing that and dealing with it, and actually encouraging staff to talk about any issues. Understanding what support and changes might be appropriate. So that's linked with the earlier slide where I said the kind of things that are being asked for. So, you know, if a manager did have a woman that was suddenly, you know, you noticed her having hot flushes, could have a conversation and say, you know, actually, would it be helpful for us to provide you with a fan, or is there anything else we can do to help you? And having those conversations and approaching it. And being aware of the law relating to the menopause. So hopefully you've seen from the kind of quick overview I gave earlier, there are a number of legal issues, and that does come into the way that this is approached and what's said or not said, how individuals are dealt with, which then may lead to legal issues and successful claims or not successful claims. So if you've got your senior staff and managers being aware of what those claims might be and what the issues might be, you prevent that. So prevention is better than cure, and hopefully you're getting ahead of that. And staff to be aware and comfortable. So as I'm saying, it's not just the managers dealing with it, it's also the staff that are going through the menopause, and anyone else that's affected by those staff going through the menopause, being aware and comfortable to deal with things, and how to deal with those things. And then the support, so encouraging informal, formal networks. So thinking about what you could do there to support staff, how you could do that, and making it part of your business strategy. So again, I think it's a really important thing that this does come from the top down, and that individuals see that and see senior people being part of it, engaging with that, because otherwise there tends to be just so, well, you know, it's not important. So, you know, why should we engage in it if they're not? So specific things for you to think about in terms of line managers. So look at attending training, be clear about roles and responsibilities. Saying to line managers and line managers, understanding some staff may be hesitant to seek support and discuss things. And if they are hesitant, be careful with that and, you know, keep going, keep talking to them, but don't push them too far. Also allowing staff time to attend menopause awareness training. So actually it comes back to that right at the start of this talk when I said, you know, some women aren't prepared to accept it or aren't even aware that they could be going through menopausal symptoms or perimenopausal symptoms. So they don't even think about that. Whereas if there's some training and awareness around that, they might set some triggers and think, okay, this is that, I can deal with it. I know where to go. Work supports me. I've got an employee helpline, or I can go to my doctor, and they can look at dealing with things. Ensuring that the line manager is familiar with the menopause and workplace policies, so how those policies interact, dealing with those policies, appropriate lines and taking things forward, how you will deal with things. So, for example, if an individual was having time off of work, is that dealt with separately under the menopausal policy, or do they go to a capability policy, understanding how they action and deal with that? And what kind of triggers you have in place, how to appropriately deal with that for the line manager. Identify potential issues in the workplace that may impact on staff going through the menopause and address this. So again, that's linked in with the looking at going through and going round and health and safety requirements and risk assessments. So that can be a really good linking together, that when the risk assessment is undertaken, you can then look at what sort of requirements there might be. So as I said, you know, should there be fans in the workplace, open window policies, or, you know, do you need to look at moving toilets, or do you need extra toilets, or all of those kind of things should be thought about. And the big thing from a legal perspective as well, and which often gets forgotten, or sometimes there's just not the time to do it, is evidencing that you're doing that as well. Because if a claim is brought, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to be able to evidence those things and what you are doing. So what else can you do? Look at awareness training and culture change. So that, as I say, there's lots of training out there, and there's different places that provide it from different aspects. But I think the real key here is trying to introduce a culture change. So it is bringing everybody into that from the top down, removing that taboo around the menopause, and encouraging and saying this is okay to talk about. We want people to talk about this. Look at your menopause policy and or a toolkit or guidelines. As I've already mentioned, I've gone over the policy, but is the policy right? Is it better to have toolkits? Is it better to have guidelines? How and where can you share that? So support and information, looking at where there's easy access for that. Do you have an intranet? Can you create a menopause page on your intranet? Or do you have a wellbeing group? Can you put that within your wellbeing group? Think about other things. So, for example, you might want to introduce menopause champions. So that's, you then look at those champions as specifically trained. Individuals know where to go. They can speak to those champions because they know that they're trained. They would hopefully feel comfortable speaking to those champions. Something that we've heard about from a few people is a menopause cafe. So kind of a place to just go and have a chat, more informal, but time off is allowed. You can go there for 10 minutes. You need a breakaway, go and have a cup of tea and have a chat with some colleagues in the menopause cafe. Think about things like flexible working. So obviously there's been massive changes with COVID and flexible working, and I know lots of people have moved to that kind of process anyway. But as we're now going back to more normal working, think about is flexible working something that can work, or even just different working hours? So it might be that the individual particularly suffers first thing in the morning, so actually they'd like to start at 10 o'clock and finish at 6 o'clock because that's better working times for them. That could be something appropriate that you need to think about. And appropriate uniforms, obviously that does depend upon the business, but something that often gets forgotten about. So I was attending an event being run by the police, and that was really interesting because they were saying the feedback they were getting was particularly around their uniforms and how heavy the uniforms were, and that it didn't really cater for women that were sweating, and wasn't something that had been thought about. So once this is raised, that's now being considered and thought about. But it's not necessarily something you would think about, you know, is the uniform appropriate for a woman going through the menopause? Maybe that's something to start thinking about. So there's a little bit there about the Brachers employment team. And we're offering for those attending today a basic template menopause policy. We would usually charge £300 plus VAT for that, but for anyone that comes to us within the next 7 days, we're offering a discounted rate of £199 plus VAT. As I say, policy is a really good starting place, but I hope what's come out of that is all of the elements around the other things that you need to be looking at and considering. So hopefully you have found that helpful. That leaves us with a nice amount of time for some questions, if we have any, Aim.
Right, let me just have a look. I saw some pop up in the Q&A. So Elaine has written, is it difficult to prove the menopause claim in an ET? I know that cases have been won, but how many out of those raised?
Okay, so I don't know the numbers that have been successful. I think that's what probably is the question there. So hopefully those numbers in terms of tribunal claims show that menopause being specifically cited is increasing. So we haven't been seeing that in the past. We're getting it more and more now. And I think you've picked up on the right thing there. So the thing is, it will be the type of claim that they bring. Then depending upon the type of claim they bring, they would have to prove that it is that type of discrimination, or if it's constructive unfair dismissal, that there has been a fundamental breach of contract. So there is always going to be legalities that have to be proved before a claim can succeed. I think that has been the issue to date, and that's why there's been this committee, because claims aren't succeeding, and it's felt that women are therefore losing out and having to walk away when they're not being treated fairly. In some instances they are, but they're not being treated fairly, and they're kind of just left at the moment with no opportunity. But yeah, I can't say I'll give you figures on percentage that have succeeded. I don't think that exists.
Okay, lovely, thank you. And another question is, as menopause is individual and has physical and psychological impacts, what would be best to cover in a policy?
That's a very hard one, but from a policy perspective, our recommendation and the stance we take is that it's a higher level policy. So it recognises the kind of symptoms that could be there. But it recognises also that individuals will appear and will be affected in different ways. So you effectively take that on board, and it will be then treating everyone as an individual. And basically it is supporting that and saying that we understand that everyone is going to be different, but we understand people will go through the menopause, and if that's being recognised, and you want to speak to us, we'll speak to you, and we will support what might need doing. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Brilliant, lovely. And then there's just a couple of queries on there. People asking, are we able to share the slides, which I know you've given me permission to do, Louise, so I'll make sure they get out to everybody after the call. So yeah, we've actually wrapped up earlier than expected, which never happens, so thank you, Louise. Is there anything else that anybody wants to ask? Oh, we've just had another one come through, sorry. I'd like to know more about your menopause policy writing services, please. We've just drafted our first menopause policy and would appreciate a review of this. Again, I think probably, as I said, I'll send out Louise's contact details. I don't know if there's anything that you want to add to that, Louise.
Yeah, no, happy to, just put us in contact and we can do that. I'm just having a look. There's another question that's just come up as well. So how would a woman prove she has a diagnosis of this? Would she need to provide a doctor's diagnosis as confirmation? The problem with this is that some women may struggle to get the confirmation from their GP. My concern is that some women may not be believed, especially those who are experiencing it early, say in their 30s or 40s. Yeah, that's a good point. In terms of evidence and tribunal claims, so the type of claims we're talking about, a disability discrimination, age or sex, they do not necessarily have to have medical evidence. And even for a disability claim where they are showing the way that they are being affected, there doesn't have to be specific medical evidence to support that. It will help it, but it will be enough for an individual to say, I'm going through this, this is how it's affecting me. So there wouldn't have to be a specific diagnosis, but they would need to fall within that definition. So i.e. that it's likely to affect them for a period of 12 months or longer, and that it's affecting them on a day-to-day basis. And that's where it's harder, that if it's disability claim, they're having to show that it's affecting them on a day-to-day basis, and there would need to be evidence to support that. But the evidence usually comes in the form of an individual just saying, I can't sleep, I'm having hot flashes, that kind of thing. So it doesn't necessarily need to be that, but I would caveat that and say, if you are a business, I think a good way to support this is to refer to occupational health and get an occupational health report, because obviously it may not be that, it may be something else. So if this is coming about because an individual is having a lot of time off or it's performance related issues, I would always suggest it's a good idea to get occupational health advice.
Brilliant. We've just had some more come in the chat. What if people don't recognise it is menopause, but it is later diagnosed? Can you work retrospectively?
Well, you can work retrospectively, can't say that word, I'll put my teeth in. In terms of as the employer, it would be difficult for an individual to bring a claim saying that you were aware, because there's different requirements of proof. So for example, with a disability claim, again, the individual would have to be able to prove that you were aware they were suffering with the menopause. So if that wasn't diagnosed, or if that wasn't clear at the time, they might not be able to prove that. So say, for example, they were saying, you should have made reasonable adjustments to my working hours. If you weren't aware at the time, there's not that obligation because you weren't aware at the time. So it's kind of helpful to you as an employer that that's the case. But once you are aware, and as soon as you're aware, you then need to be taking steps to make sure that you're understanding how that affects the individual. Do you need to be making adjustments? Because otherwise then you potentially are liable.
Okay. I think you've probably answered this question in that last answer. So should organisations amend their sickness trigger points for those suffering with absence relating to menopause?
Yeah, again, it's going to be very individual, because if it potentially is a disability, then potentially you should be adjusting it, but it may not be a disability. So the adjustment comes in as, is that a reasonable adjustment when considering performance, etc. So it's reasonable adjustments which are required under the Equality Act, which fall within all of those other considerations that I've been saying. It gets very complicated. So my answer would be, no, don't adjust your policy. But when you're looking at an individual, or when someone's line managing an individual and these issues are being raised, you do need to look at them on a case-by-case basis and may need to make an adjustment for that individual.
Okay, brilliant. Lovely. So that is probably a good place to pause and just to kind of wrap up. So I will send out a follow-up email to everyone that has signed up for today's event. This will include Louise's contact details, an invite to our free Guild networking app for HR professionals, and details of our next event. I will also be posting about today's event on LinkedIn. I would really appreciate it if you can comment on the post. We don't charge for these events, so by adding your comment, you will help increase awareness of our brand. If anyone is currently recruiting, please feel free to drop me a message. We also have Accountancy Recruit and FD Recruit within the group. Finally, a massive thank you to Louise for stepping in at such short notice and doing such a great job. and also to all our listeners for tuning in. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.